Okay, and welcome back, or welcome for the first time. Anyway, we are going to jump into it. So what we want to do in this one is configure the multi-panel. If you don't have a separate MCP and you're using the multi-panel, oh, the PMDG is coming alive. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump into the cockpit. So if we go ahead and we look at our cockpit so that we're in it, we will get started. Okay, so first things first, we want to make sure, as I drag over SPAD, we want to make sure that we have our multi-panel, and we want to make sure that the data values are updating as we expect. So I've got the knob selector set to Alt, and then as I turn that knob, I can see the real data in the sim updating, and of course on the multi-panel the data is also updating. So first off, the selector on the physical panel is what sets what you see in the display on the left-hand side. So if I physically put this to the VS slot, we see the VS update. So just keep that in mind. So we're in altitude. So now this blue area, when we click on it, it will give us the values that the display and the control knob are performing. These text strings on the left-hand side, they cannot be modified. That's what Connex has stated. So that they're hard-coded inside of the multi-panel from Saitek. The values that we write over here on the right-hand side of the display, those can be selected and each one can be picked. So for the altitude, the top line, you pick it when it is on the altitude mode. The bottom line, the VS line, when you switch into VS mode, you'll notice that the altitude and the VS settings don't disappear. And that's because that, again, is what's hard-coded. So here, when that's selected, and in SPAD, when you select the screen, you'll notice that now you're changing the display value, but that's just for the VS slot. When you're in VS mode or you're in altitude mode for the selector, you will still always see the altitude and the VS. So those never change. Well, sorry, those stay the same in both. But for the knob is tracking what this is set to. So right now the knob is going to be whatever value I associate to the VS mode. This is the default, and you can download this, but again, it's not required. You can always manually program your Autopilot yourself. So first up, altitude mode, we're going to select the screen, we're going to make sure to assign for the display value, that is going to be the MCP.altitude. So when we click on it, select display source value, source, we want to make sure that our PMDG 777 variables are selected, so check. And then what we're going to do is now we get the drop down for the PMDG. And the easiest thing to have done would have been to type in mcp.alt, and if I could read my keyboard correctly, .alt, you'll notice that's going to filter it down nicely. So now we've nicely got our mcp.altitude, and that's what we would have selected and clicked OK. And that's now going to be what our item displays. So if we were to have added event, it would have been display mode, right? Display mode, action to control the mode of the display on or off, display value, And when we click on that display value for the first time, it's automatically going to pop into select data definition, and that's where we would have gone PMDG 777, and then we would have gone MCP dot altitude. We would have found our altitude and we would have assigned it, and we would have seen current value is 10,000, which is correct. We would have clicked OK, and we would have clicked OK. Then we got our altitude, and away we go. Then we would have saved. Now obviously I've now entered it twice, so we're going to go ahead and delete that one event. So then we want to add an event for the tuner clockwise, and again, similar type thing. We're going to add an action. The action is going to be a send simulation event. So we want a simulation event. Then it would have been PMDG, and we would have typed in MCP dot MCP not dot underscore altitude selector. So we would have selected the altitude selector, and now from the drop down we're going to want to select either a mouse wheel or a mouse button, and so here what you can see we have for the clockwise turn is we have the mouse wheel up. So when you would hover on that value and you'd use your mouse wheel, that would increase the value. So now we're using a mouse wheel up, and then altitude selector mouse wheel down event. Don't worry about the parameter value. That's automatically selected when you pick your PMDG special value. That's how PMDG registers the difference between clicks and mouse wheel events and other special priorities. Okay, so we now have the altitude display and control done. So let's go ahead and we'll go to the VS mode, highlight it, and we would save as we went. And you can see that for the display we want the MCP.vert speed, and then for the knob you want the MCP vertical speed selector. And again, just by seeing the 16384, I know that that's going to be mouse wheel up, right? So that value here you'll see repeated a lot, and so 8192 is the value for mouse wheel down. We're going to go to IAS next. Same thing, display value, we want PMDG 777 MCP.IAS mock, and that's going to display our speed. And then we've got, again, our speed, MCP speed selector event, and again, that's the mouse wheel event. Okay, so heading. On our heading, same thing, MCP.heading, and then we're using the heading MCP heading selector events for our clockwise turn. And again, those are mouse wheel up and mouse wheel down. Finally, when we go to course, you would, no events are set for course. So let's go ahead and we're going to add an event, and we want the display value. And we're going to go PMDG, and we're going to go MCP. Oh, there is none. That's why this doesn't have it. Duh. And I'm going to leave this in the video on purpose, because if we go MCP dot course, nothing's going to come up, right? And that makes sense, because the PMDG does not actually have anything to do with course, because it auto courses. Pretty cool thing about the plane, you don't need to set up a course or an OBS value, so to speak, for your ILSs, because when you program it in, the PMDG does all that. Well, a 777 does all that, the PMD 777, but a 777 does all that for you. So the course can't be adjusted, and you could reserve this value for putting some other display up there from the PMD display if you wanted. And then assign the knob for a clockwise turn and a counterclockwise turn. So again, something maybe in the sim where you can use mouse wheel up, mouse wheel down, you could apply there and put the value on the course display as something to apply it to. Completely up to you. Okay, so for the autopilot, and again, these are pretty much the default values that come from the online Snippet. There's the kind of getting started one. But so PMDG 777 event, when that event equals 0, so that's the PMDG enunciators MCP autopilot 0. So that's this button here. And essentially what's happening is when that equals 0, so when that's off, it will set the multi-panel short mode off. So it's going to basically turn the button light off. And when the short mode goes on, so when that value hits 1, it's going to go on. And then what they've done here is made the autopilot button. So the autopilot button is now a toggle. So your autopilot button is now a toggle. And it's making sure to press both the left switch and the right switch so that both autopilot buttons will be toggled when you press the button. And again, that toggles the button. That makes the state do what the state is expecting it to do. And then these variables for controlling the button light, change button light. So when the button light 0, set it to short mode off, permanent mode on. Heading mode. So operating it the exact same way, in that using 0 and 1 for the button modes, and again the value is going off and finding the enunciator MCP heading hold. So again, when this button is lit up, this button will also light up. So those two will match. So it's using the enunciators, which is great. Your button press for a short time. So that's the quick button press. That is the MCP heading push switch event. So that's this button here. And again, when we click on that button, and let's bring SPAD back in. When we press that that heading select button, that will enable the heading select switch. So that will turn on the heading mode, and it will invoke the value you've dialed in. If you press the hold button in the screen, that's going to lock to your current airplane heading. So you may have hand flown it, turned it, and now you're on a heading in a direction that you want to go. By clicking on the hold button, it's going to enable heading mode, but it's also going to capture the value that the plane is actually flying. And so what's programmed in the default one is that when you hold for a long time, so if you hold the button for longer than 1 second, it's going to invoke the MCP heading hold switch. So it's going to press the switch button, which is going to capture your current heading, not fly the heading that you pre-programmed. So the short button will enable the heading mode and fly the pre-programmed value you have in there, not the current plane value. Nav. So nav mode, it's tracking the multi-panel on, and it's using the enunciator for the LNAV. So as long as LNAV is enabled, so the LNAV button, if that's lit up, then the button light for nav is going to light up. So if we hit what you'll also notice is you pressing the button, it's going to toggle both the LNAV and the VNAV switches. So again, if I press this one button, the LNAV and the VNAV would enable. based on what we're doing with the Autopilot. And so it's going to enable both, so you can't separate the two here. This also can lead to some difficult things. So what you're going to notice is there is no actions with some intelligence. So do this with conditions. I may have programmed these originally if I was doing this. Again, I have a separate MCP, so I don't actually use this one. I don't use the Saitek one at all anymore. I have a Virtual Avionics 737 MCP, so I use that. But if I have stayed with the Saitek one, I probably would have come in here and I would have separated these two values. So what I might have done is quickly just copied this. So copy this event, and then I would have pasted it. So I've got a second one. And what I would have probably done is I would have deleted this, and I would have said, okay, toggle the event, and I would have tied it into making sure that the two of them using conditions, I would have double checked if the parameter was set. And then what you end up doing is you move this button pressed event and you tie it into the Autopilot on and the switch event. But again, the default will work most of the time. It's just really hard because you don't have enough buttons physically on the panel. The other option that you could have gone for would have been to separate these two so that LNAV might be on the short press and I might enable the long press, so hold for longer than 1 second would be the toggle for the VNAV. And that way you could separate VNAV and LNAV but still use the nav button. Anyway, digressing, those are options. When you look at the IAS button, so again, same thing, it's using the enunciator event, a PMDG enunciator event, which is the Autothrottle. So currently, it's using the Autothrottle to enable that, and so that's this button here, the AT button, and that's going to turn the light on based on the state of the Autothrottle button. And so if you press the button for less than 1 second, that is the push the speed switch. And so that's going to actually push this switch here. And that's going to toggle it in and out of IAS mode so that you can toggle between the two and then set your value. The long time event is going to enable the autothrottle switch here, so the AT switch. And that's very useful because what it's going to do for you is when that's enabled, you don't really disable it, but the push or the short toggle of this button is going to put this in and out of kind of an override mode. So when this is lit up and you see it, so when that's lit up and you see it, then the value you dial in is what you get. But when you press that switch button, right now we don't see anything, but we would see it in flight, is that's going to toggle and turn that display off, because with LNAV and VNAV, it's going to also use your profile speed from your CDU. And when that light is out and you see nothing in that screen inside of the PMDG, you're essentially getting the equivalent here. So if I see this lit up, that's going to allow me to control the speed semi-manually, I guess, because it's still auto throttle, but now you're dialing in the speed that you want. When that display is not lit up, then it is going to be using the program speed that you put for the CDU. So again, that's the difference between this button press, which is the knob itself actually can be pressed, versus the enable of auto throttle. Okay. Altitude. Altitude works the same way. So again, it's basing this on, is it in altitude mode? So you're now controlling the altitude with the altitude selector as opposed to VNAV mode. And your altitude short mode on off. So again, this is using the annunciator to light the button. Is it in alt hold mode? Again, this works similar to the way that heading works. The heading works in that you've got the short press, which is going to push the knob, and that's your altitude push switch. This is important because when you're flying and you dial up your new altitude that ATC gives you, so if we're supposed to go up to, if we were now told to go from 10,000 up to, say, 15,000, we would have to press that alt button again to tell the autopilot to now climb to that new altitude that we want. This is really nice because it allows you to prepare the event. So for example, on departure, climb 4,000, expect 1/8,000 10 minutes after departure. So we initially would set up 4,000, we would climb up to 4,000, we'd level off at 4,000, and now the pilot could enter 10,000 because they know that's the altitude that's going to be coming, but by dialing in 10,000 at this moment, the plane's not actually going to climb, not until we click on it, and now that's the new altitude that we're supposed to go to. So just like heading, if you hold the switch for longer than 1 second, that's like pressing the altitude hold button. And so the altitude hold button is going to capture your current altitude. So it's going to enable altitude hold mode and capture the current altitude that the plane is at. And so again, sometimes people don't like that because they want to pre-dial the 10,000, they want to climb out, and as they approach it, they want to enable the mode and not have to then, you know, they enabled it at 9,500 and now they got to tweak it back up to 10,000. Your VS, so again, you've got your VS, which you have your VS FPA button. So again, that's going to be driven by the annunciator. So a 0 and a 1, does it light or doesn't it light? Then what you've got is your button pressed for a short time is going to be pressing the VS switch. So pressing that switch to enable or disable the event. Now, if you hold it for a long time, that is going to be pressing the VS FPA switch, so flight path attitude. So this here is the button up here that it's talking about, right? So that long hold is going to press this VS FPA button that we've got up here. Okay, moving on to the approach button. So we've programmed this to follow the approach button that's here, the APP. And again, it's tracking the annunciator, so if the annunciator is off, it'll keep the button light off. If the annunciator is on, it's going to keep the button light on. Pretty straightforward, not hard to figure out. And then again, we've got our event for the MCP approach switch. So again, this is got the approach switch event, and it is a left mouse click, because for pushing buttons, which will give this automatic parameter value, which for pushing buttons with a single click, if I was in the cockpit, I would be hovering over top and I would be single clicking that event. Away you go. The other thing that was done is glide slope / reverse. So that's just what the reverse back course button is called, and it's been applied in the default to be the localizer switch event, so the loc event. So if you want to enable the localizer, you capture the localizer. Once you're captured on the localizer, you are then able to enable approach mode after the localizer has been captured, and the glide slope is starting to come in. You can enable approach mode. Anyway, digressing. So that's pressing that button there, and the lights will follow its annunciator lights. So all in all, it's a pretty good mapping for the default. It's pretty easy to do. So when we come over to our auto throttle, you'll notice that when switched on, set the event. So set off, and when switched off, set parameter 1. So if we look at this, the switch mode is reversed, is essentially what it seems like. So switched on is actually the off, I guess, and the arm side is when it actually enables them. I guess that's just how SPAD sees the switch, and how the switch is actually wired. For the flaps, you've got the upside, we've got event MCP, altitude increase selector. So this here, single click right mouse button. So this is what is going to toggle it from auto mode into 1000s mode. So instead of flaps, what's happening is you can see the altitude by clicking the flap button, and on the screen here you'll see that the altitude selector is going into 1000s mode. So now when we increase, we're increasing by 1000 feet at a time, and if we flap down, so put it into auto mode, then it's going to figure stuff out on its own. So at certain altitudes, it's going to increase by 100s instead of 1000 at a time. So it's kind of neat. It's a neat use case that somebody applied for the flaps button. Somebody was probably Connex. And then you've got your pitch trim. And so the pitch trim is mapped directly to your MCP VS selector wheel as well. So that's automatically mapped to that. So you got a nice wheel automatically mapped to it. Pretty straightforward. That's how you map the Autopilot panel, so multi-panel, from Saitek into the PMDG G777. Thanks a lot for watching, and if there's anything else that you guys can think of, feel free to comment it. Hopefully this helps leverage the effort as opposed to having to constantly answer similar questions inside of the forums. Alright, thanks a lot, guys.